No one likes a freeloader, but are we hardwired to punish them? To answer this question, researchers in England and Germany created an economic game for their students. The goal was simple: make as much money as possible by cooperating together. Each player was given 20 tokens to contribute towards a public good. In return, each player equally profits from the public good, independent of his or her own contribution. To play the game, you could join one of two teams. The first, more altruistic group depended on voluntary cooperation. Give what you can, when you can, and we all benefit. The second group was much less goodwill-oriented. You must pay, and members can punish those who did not chip in. They could choose to fine the freeloader 3 tokens, but it would cost them one of their own tokens to do so. Initially, 2/3 of the players chose the first group, but then, curiously, despite initially prioritizing goodwill, most players abandoned that group when they saw that those in the punishment group were prospering more. Even more curious was that former freeloaders of the first group were some of the most enthusiastic converts to the punishment mode. They weren't just looking for the best payoff, no, they gave up freeloading to punish others. When the game ended after 30 rounds, the people in the punishment group had donated an average of 18 tokens per round, while the Goodwill group had almost no members, and those who remained only donated 3 tokens to the public good on average per round. But the most curious result of all, little actual punishment was applied during the later rounds of the game, because the threat of punishment was enough to ensure cooperation. It appears people's idea of a happy, cooperative society where everyone gets along tends to fall apart when a few freeloaders show up. And in fact, we might actually get pleasure from punishing someone mooching off the system. Now, while this was just a theoretical exercise, it actually tells us a lot about prevailing attitudes on who freeloads off of our social systems, and how misconceptions about that freeloading complicates policy-making decisions for governments both in the United States and in Europe. So, let's get started. So why do so many hold vitriol for those who accept a helping hand from the government, especially those who they themselves would benefit from it?
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
When President Ronald Reagan uttered those infamous words in his 1981 inaugural address to the country, he was referring specifically to the government's role in helping bring the U.S. out of an economic crisis. But since then, it's become a manifesto mainstay in conservative and libertarian circles, in the United States and beyond.
Government is a result of politicians with no principles.
The government has become this proverbial phantom pain in everyone's backside. And the main policy objective on the right has been to reduce the amount of government as much as possible.
Less government, less government, less government, less government.
But here's the problem. Many of the people who accept this dogma as truth are some of the very people who would benefit from more government the most. In the United States, for example, research shows that Republican states are disproportionately dependent on federal aid. Yet many Republican voters appear blissfully unaware of this contradiction. Examinations in southern states like Kentucky showcase that despite the average person getting more than 30, 40, or 50% of their income from federal social benefits, they routinely elect public officials that slash funding or add restrictions to the programs that feed, house, educate, and employ their constituents. And in Germany, as another example, the AfD party, a far-right nationalist party, has seen widespread and growing support in the former East German states. These are states which are also disproportionately dependent on federal aid and disproportionately economically disadvantaged. So you would think, on the surface, that voters in these areas would be more motivated by parties that were interested in lessening the financial burden, whether through lower taxes or increased social spending. But just like in Kentucky, voters in Eastern German states voted for a party with plans to do the opposite. Comprehensive analysis from the ZEW in Mannheim make it clear that the AfD's 2025 key proposal for a reform of taxation, minimum wage, and social benefits would not help the average East German family, but instead financially hurt them. According to their analysis, should the AfD program be implemented, a family with a median income of 40,000 euros per year would have 440 euros less than they do now. Now, of course, money alone is not the sole motivating factor in someone's voting habits, but amidst calls of a cost of living crisis, inflation, and stagnating wages, it certainly is a major consideration. But beyond misconceptions on who actually benefits from public programs, one of the things that I find extremely interesting is that there seems to be a shift in the scapegoat for not necessarily who, but what is responsible for all of the problems of government. While race, ethnicity, and migration status are all part of this conversation, the dominant discussion as of late has been instead on government waste and inefficiency.
This is a gigantic fraud loophole.
And it has become such a major point of discussion in the United States that we officially have a newly branded Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, which aims to cut spending, waste, and fraud. Nonetheless, led by the world's richest man who's currently being sued by the SEC on securities violations. Now, I'm sure it'll work out well. But listen, political jabs aside, I think honestly, whether you are liberal or conservative or independent, when it comes to things like government spending, all of us want a government that is more accountable and more transparent on where our tax dollars go. But when trimming the fat, it's really curious that the targets of these efficiency cuts aren't necessarily the ones with the most spending waste, but the ones with the most freeloaders, or the ones we perceive as having the most freeloaders. So let's take a look at some of the myths that perpetuate these kind of cuts. The governments across all OECD countries have assistance programs in place to support those who can't afford food, housing, healthcare, and other needs. This is sometimes referred to as a social safety net, a system of programs designed to support people struggling economically. But it is so much more than just simply programs of a last resort. In the vast majority of cases, these are actually entitlement programs, meaning you have earned those benefits. And despite it feeling like we're getting less bang for our buck when it comes to those benefits, the spending for these social programs has actually grown substantially over time. When you look across the OECD, public social expenditure amounted to less than 10% of GDP in 1960, but it has more than doubled to just over 20% on average since. Now, conservatives in the United States, and quite frankly a lot of countries, but I don't want to be overly sweeping here, will focus on how spending for these social programs has ballooned over time. But so too has the public's payments into these programs. Now, this is a tad old, but it's still illustrative nonetheless. In the United States, payments into social insurance programs represented an estimated 37%, or $807 billion of federal receipts in 2011, compared to 31%, or $455 billion in 1981, and 17% in 1961. Including federal employees' payments into their retirement accounts. Keep in mind, the historical numbers are in fact adjusted for inflation here. And as a point of reference, you can see somewhat similar trends in Germany as well. We pay more today in social insurance programs than previous generations. But again, the most significant group of these freeloaders taking public benefits aren't freeloading at all. They paid for these benefits. And in fact, in most countries, the largest expenditure of public benefits go to senior citizens. In the United States, Social Security and Medicare account for 55% of federal benefit dollars. In the UK, pensioner spending is the biggest item in the Social Security budget, accounting for 48.1% of the total in 2023-24. And EU-wide in 2022, some 46% of total expenditures on social protection benefits in the EU was for the old age and survivors function, followed by the sickness and healthcare function with 30%. I think most of us tend to believe that senior citizens, people who have worked throughout their entire life, deserve some form of protection from the ups and downs of life that come in later years. But what I think is so interesting is that especially in the United States, when we hear about people who are quote-unquote living off the government, this myth is often used to perpetuate a stereotype of poor, lazy, freeloading adults who are unwilling to work. But the reality is that, in fact, the vast majority of people who are living off the government are people who can no longer work due to age or disability. And again, they've paid into these benefits. But the stereotype prevails, and it gets into especially murky water when immigration enters the chat. Okay, so just a quick disclaimer here. While I am personally an immigrant who lives in a foreign country on a permanent residence visa, I am not a minority immigrant, and I moved to Germany voluntarily. So while I am part of this immigration discussion, my legal status and inherent privilege do affect how others perceive me and how I participate in this system. I also want to caution about focusing too much here on the economic value of people. Immigrants, refugees, and migrants are human beings. And just like you don't look at your neighbor and determine their worth to a particular cash value, you shouldn't do the same to them either. But this is a video, after all, where I'm talking about public welfare benefits and the myths that surround them. And whether you're somebody watching this video in the United States or Europe, there have been pretty loud calls from people who have concerns that immigrants specifically are a fiscal drain on these public benefits. Particularly here in Germany, where I live, there's been increasing concerns that welfare state generosity works as a social magnet. Basically, that immigrants move to countries with strong social safety nets because they want to freeload and reap all of the cushy benefits. However, despite the fact that policymakers around the EU and North America have frequently relied on this hypothesis to justify reforms to welfare policy that cut benefit levels for immigrants or tighten eligibility requirements, the actual evidence for welfare migration is quite weak. But regardless of what ultimately incentivizes someone to move, the data is actually quite clear that immigrants are a net positive for the countries in which they move to. But that being said, while irregular migration is often in the spotlight, the reality is that irregular entries account for a relatively small fraction of migration in total in the EU and the United States. But if you turn on the TV, it accounts for an overwhelming amount of media headlines.
Deportation.
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 Illegal immigration.
On illegal migration.
Illegal aliens.
Even though non-citizens make up 15% of the U.S. population and contribute 25% of small business growth, refugees and asylum seekers in the United States are often treated as scapegoats for politicians to achieve certain political goals. For example, the Trump administration continues to perpetuate long-standing hostility against refugees, falsely claiming that they exploit government benefits, spike crime, and take American jobs.
By the way, you know who's taking the jobs that are created? 107% of those jobs are taken by illegal aliens.
But again, I cannot stress this enough. Empirical research data doesn't support it. On the national level, refugees have contributed an estimated $269.1 billion in revenue to all levels of government from 2005 to 2014 and have had a positive net fiscal impact over this same 10-year period of $63 billion US. Refugees and migrants are also less likely to commit crime than native-born citizens in both the US and much of Western Europe. And in 2017, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine released a mammoth report titled The Economic and Fiscal Consequences of Immigration. It found that although immigrants tend to earn less than native-born workers and are therefore a bit more costly to their governments, their children exhibit unusually high levels of upward mobility and are, quote, among the strongest economic and fiscal contributors in the entire population. And for countries with an aging labor force like the United States, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, immigrants can act as a kind of fiscal band-aid, helping to make the math work temporarily for providing old age benefits like Social Security, pension benefits, and Medicare, to name a few. The third myth about freeloading, specifically about welfare programs, is that these programs are rampant with fraud to the tune of extravagant amounts to taxpayers. But the thing is, entitlement programs, from pension programs to food stamps, housing assistance to Medicare, don't actually see unusually high cheating rates. And the culprits are usually managers and executives, not welfare queens, if you're old enough to get that reference. So let's take a look at everyone's favorite punching bag, food stamps, or as they're known in the United States, SNAP benefits. SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, provides monthly funds to buy groceries. It's the largest anti-hunger program in America and helped an average of more than 41 million low-income people per month in 2024. But over the past several years, there have been various attempts by the federal government to, quote, eliminate loopholes, waste, fraud, and abuse in the system.
I think there's a lot of fraud in the system. Those are savings that we can plug into the budget.
But for decades, SNAP has had among the most rigorous eligibility determination and payment accuracy measurement system of any federal benefit program. Beneficiaries intentionally ripping off the taxpayers account for perhaps less than 1% of all payments. And before you argue with me in the comment section, SNAP recipients are not lazy freeloaders either. 2/3 of participants are children, elderly, and people with disabilities who are not expected to work. And the remaining 1/3 are subject to strict work requirements. And the millions of people who fall into this category are overwhelmingly employed with jobs that provide low pay, shifting schedules, and lack key benefits like paid sick leave. So maybe, instead of blaming the freeloading individual, if we actually held employers accountable to provide their employees with a livable wage, with regular work schedules, and basic human rights benefits like paid sick leave, we wouldn't be in this position in the first place. But I digress. And while I have probably most definitely spent too much time in this section talking about the American example, I do want to pause here and just reiterate that fraud and abuse and waste in these government programs does happen in other countries and actually happens at similar, very, very low rates. Take Germany as an example. Corruption and billing fraud in the German healthcare system causes an annual damage of around 14 billion euros for the community of solidarity, according to a study from the Fraunhofer Institute. And given that annual spending is around 450 billion in total, this would amount to about 3% of improper payments. In the UK, it's even lower. It's estimated that the NHS is vulnerable to about £1.316 billion worth of fraud each year, constituting less than 1% of total spending. And just late last year, the Swedish government published a report which estimated that each year, about 15 to 20 billion Swedish kroner is paid out in incorrect pension payments, half of which is suspected to be benefit fraud. And while this is not an insignificant amount of money, it too is less than 1% of fraud, even if we assume the worst case scenario of 20 billion. And listen, I'm not saying that fraud is something that we should necessarily ignore, but if we live in reality, fraud is the cost of doing business in pretty much every sector. According to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, or the ACFE, across the globe, the typical business loses 5% of its revenue to fraud each year. And again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do our due diligence to anticipate and curb fraud when it happens, but it's really important to remember that fraud and waste in government programs is not large, it's not extraordinary, and it's probably less than what happens in private industry. So all of that being said, if fraud, waste, and inefficiency aren't quite as big of a deal as our politicians would have us believe, and if freeloaders aren't freeloading as freely, then what exactly is the cause for all of this concern? And why does it dominate headlines around the globe? My theory is that we as a society need a gentle reminder that the hallmark of a good government is not one with high levels of efficiency, but rather one which is effective in absorbing inefficiencies. The most efficient allocation of goods is through the free open market, which is in part what makes capitalism so attractive. But efficient doesn't necessarily mean effective when it comes to public goods. The elderly and most vulnerable in our communities are proof of this concept. The classic example is the private market for health insurance, who has unfortunately come to the conclusion that dying people are expensive, that the elderly tend to kick the bucket at higher rates, and thus they won't insure them. It's efficient for a business, but it's also cruel. So we have Medicare in the United States, the NHS in the UK, and the Krankenversicherung der Rente in Germany. While it's easy and catchy to lambast the government as inefficient, the truth is, in cases like Medicare, Social Security, public housing, WIC benefits, and more, you want a government that's capable of absorbing the impact of inefficient yet socially responsible scenarios. Measures such as subsidized health insurance, food and nutrition programs, and targeted cash payments to the poor, it is said, incentivize idleness, encourage freeloading, and create a culture of dependency. Yet, the majority of the social programs in these countries have budgets that are too low to deliver services well. But any slip in performance is chastised and held up as proof of their ineptitude and inefficiency. And as a response, policymakers routinely cut funding, allow inflation to erode benefits, and make social programs harder for people to access. Listen, no one likes a freeloader, and in fact, it may actually be part of the human condition to want to punish them. But I think it's important to remember that overwhelmingly, the freeloading that happens for our public welfare programs are not from beneficiaries who are defrauding or scamming our social system, but instead are likely coming from businesses, executives, and politicians. And perhaps we don't hold them to task nearly as often. As always, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from Type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So, I'll see you next Sunday. Cheers!